Joining me today. This presentation is called Thoughts and Emotions. It's an exploration of cognitive behavioral therapy for relapse prevention of substance use disorders. I'm going to waste no time today. We'll just jump right into it. Substance use disorders, defined by the DSM-5 as a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms, indicating that the individual continues using the substances despite significant substance-related problems that could be legal, health, etc. Relapse of substance use disorder is a return to use of substances after a period of abstinence, sort of like cancer going into remission and then the tumor growing back. And the national relapse rate is 40 to 60% according to National Institute of Drug Abuse, which isn't great odds. It's really just the flip of a coin as to who's going to relapse and who might not. And it's difficult for our clients because relapse triggers are everywhere. So the biggest part of our job as SUDPs is to get them ready for all the triggers that they might encounter when they leave our education, our treatment. So some of these common relapse factors can be just like physically encountering the substance that they use. Perhaps they're an alcoholic and they go out to dinner with family and people are all around them drinking. That could be a hard thing for some people to be able to deal with. And then there's just everyday stress, work, life, relationship problems, peer pressure, physical pain is a big trigger for some people. And even having a positive mood is sometimes a trigger. That's sort of their go-to thing when they're feeling good and happy. They want to celebrate, and that relationship to the substance is there. And what it boils down to really is that a person's thoughts about these situations can have a lot of power. And this is where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. So today, a lot of this is probably going to be a review, but I think there's some things that hopefully you'll be able to take with you and implement with your clients for relapse prevention purposes. So today we're going to discuss the relapse process and then some basics of CBT, common negative thought patterns, where they come from, how to change thoughts, and how to put them all together for relapse prevention for our clients. So starting here, it said that relapse is really a process and not so much just one event that just happens out of nowhere. It's typical for relapse to start long before the actual substance use happens. And so the relapse is said to happen in 3 stages: the emotional, the mental, and the physical. Sorry, I moved my slide a little preemptively there. The signs of this emotional relapse are generally, it's pretty unconscious with the thoughts of using, and it's more just sort of underlying feelings and behaviors that are happening that we may not be consciously aware of either. So these sorts of things can be signs of trouble ahead and that relapse is just around the corner. So a person might all of a sudden have a spike in anxiety, become just very intolerant with people around them, be quick to anger, defensive, wild mood swings. They might start to isolate themselves away from others, stop asking for help, stop going to meetings, and generally just stop taking care of themselves, not eating or overeating, not sleeping well or sleeping all day. This stage of relapse is the easiest to deal with if the person doesn't take the necessary steps in this phase of relapse. It just continues to get harder. So it's very important for us to make our clients aware that when something is feeling a little off, our emotions aren't, level, our behavior isn't what we're normally experiencing on a day-to-day basis, that we should stop and sort of examine that. And the very first thing as a substance user, they should be asking themselves, where can this lead? If I continue with these feelings and these behaviors, um, is this going to take me to a relapse, right? So just acknowledging that in the moment can potentially stop the relapse process altogether, right here in this stage of relapse. So the next stage, and the more difficult stage, is the mental relapse. This is where actual conscious thought of using can creep in for us. It can be putting ourselves in places where we know people are using, thinking about those people, places, or things that we used to use with. We start glamorizing our use from the past. We start fantasizing about all the good things that came from using and sort of leaving out the bad things. We start lying to our friends and families. We just really actively start thinking about relapse, and we set ourselves up for it. We plan our relapse around other people's schedules, making sure that no one's going to be around to be able to stop us when we decide to do it. If a person is unable to win the fight against their mental relapse, then they'll eventually move on to the physical stage. And this physical stage can still be reeled in, but it's very unlikely. A person in physical relapse will go to the bar, call their dealer, and even potentially use in that moment. And even if they use, they can still stop a relapse from happening, because there is a difference between a lapse and a relapse. And a lapse can happen one time, right? We used and we immediately regretted it, and we turn back and get back on track right away. But a relapse is when we lapse and then we just sort of say, screw it, I messed up and I've ruined everything, so I'm just going to continue to use. So the idea that our thoughts can dictate our emotions and our behaviors is nothing really new. The Buddha once said, your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts. I really connect with this. I do believe that if we are not constantly sort of examining our process of being in general, that it can take us by surprise and harm us more than we realize. Even Shakespeare said, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Cognitive behavioral asserts that we dictate our feelings and behaviors by our thoughts. It's just a reinforcing cycle. If we think that things are good, things will generally be good. Bad things can still happen, but we can still see the good. If we look at things as all bad, then generally we paint the picture with a negative tint to it. So like I said, the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy is the fact that our thoughts create our feelings create our behaviors, and then our behaviors end up reinforcing those thoughts. An example of what that might look like, this reinforcing cycle of negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, can start with a person having the thought, God, I hate myself. And that thought creates feelings of depression, shame, guilt, whatever the feeling may be that comes up there. And the person doesn't want to feel those feelings. So to deal with those feelings, cover up those feelings, the person uses the drug so they feel better or doesn't feel anything at all. And then once the behavior is complete, the thoughts and feelings creep back in and reinforce the whole cycle. The using reinforces the shame and the guilt, and reinforces the reason why they hate themselves. So it's all very intertwined and they feed off of each other. So there's two main founders of cognitive behavioral therapy, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. These are the two men that basically created cognitive behavioral therapy as we know it today. Their ideas were very similar, but had very slight differences. Albert Ellis's cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy, was originally titled Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. And he asserted that people are not disturbed by things, but rather the way they view things. And irrational emotive behavioral therapy asserts that the way people feel are largely just influenced by the way they think, which is the basic premise of cognitive behavioral therapy. He also states that a person causes themselves unnecessary pain because they hold very rigid expectations of their self and others, and these rigid expectations, which can hardly ever be met, create negative emotions pretty consistently. Irrational beliefs that are tied to those expectations are feeling excessively upset over other people's mistakes or misconduct, believing that that they must be 100% competent and successful in everything to be valued and worthwhile as a person, and believing that they will be happier if they avoid all of life's difficulties and challenges. Ellis came up with the ABC model to illustrate this. A being the activating event, making a mistake. B being the belief, which is the irrational thought that the person holds, I must always do everything right. And then C being the consequence, which is the negative emotion that comes from that. Ellis suggested rather than simply being warm and supportive, that therapists need to be blunt and honest and logical in order to push people towards changing their thoughts and behaviors. So he took a more confrontational style to his therapy, whereas Aaron Beck uh, was more client centered, and helped clients examine their thoughts. So his cognitive therapy was originally designed to treat patients with depression, and he asserted that most depressed clients usually had faulty thinking patterns and held negative core beliefs, which we'll explore in the next few slides. Unlike Ellis's more direct approach of telling clients if they had faulty thinking, Beck used a Socratic method to help clients discover their faulty thinking. And a Socratic method is basically an argumentative sort of debate with oneself about their thoughts and their beliefs. As you may remember from your education on motivational interviewing, when a client can come up with their own conclusions about things, they're more likely to believe it and be able to engage in changing those problematic behaviors. Excuse me. Sorry. Back to it. So, what are these faulty thinking patterns that Beck brought to our attention? He called them cognitive distortions and and core beliefs. Um, so we will examine what those are here in the next couple of slides. So cognitive distortions are basically just these automatic faulty thinking patterns that most people have. Really, it's not unique to a person with a particular mental health disorder or a substance use disorder, but it's very much something that all of us probably deal with at one point in time in one situation or another. I know when I'm working with my clients and I show them these lists of distortions and core beliefs, that most of them can identify with just about every single one on the list. I know from my own experience in my own therapy, I certainly related to at least 95% of the list, and taking part in those kinds of thinking errors um, when dealing with my emotional issues of the past. Um, so let's go through some of these distortions and illustrate some examples of what that might look like. So first is all or nothing thinking, and this is when people see things in black and white categories with really no gray area. Um, and it's good to note that these distortions, these are extremes, extreme ways of thinking, with generally not a lot of exploration and rationality behind them. So all or nothing thinking, people see things in black and white categories. So someone might say, I've tried that, it didn't work, so I just gave up. Or if I can't be the best, then it's pointless to try. So it's either here or it's here, and there's no in between. Overgeneralizing. I see people doing this one every day. They just want to put everything into that category, even if that's only been an experience that they've had one time. So believing that something will always happen because it happened one time. So someone might say, I've seen people go back to drinking after attending AA, so I don't think those meetings would help me. Even though they might only know one person who used to go to AA and that person relapsed and went back to drinking, they've made a decision that that's the way it is, that even if they go to AA, they're not going to be able to stop drinking. And then there's filtering. And this is focusing on negative aspects of people or situations while filtering out all of the positive aspects. When we go back to what we were talking about, people setting themselves up in a mental relapse, I think this is one of those things where they filter the opposite way, right? So they see only the positives and disregard all of the negatives. But here, the example is, I know someone who stopped drinking. He seems bored and miserable. So we're just focused on, all these negative things that are going to come out of stopping drinking. Jumping to conclusions. So we draw a negative conclusion when there's little or no evidence to support it. Something like, my friend interrupted me twice. I must really be boring because they don't care what I have to say, apparently. And that's something that could really bring up some negative thoughts. If we aren't quick to nip that in the bud, we start resenting our friend and thinking badly of ourselves. Mind reading and fortune telling, believing that you know how others are feeling and thinking without any evidence, believing you can predict the future outcome while ignoring all other options. An example of this might be, I know she hates me, or that person thinks I'm a failure, or fortune telling, like, I'm going to fail this test. I'm going to fail this test. And those kinds of things really, really all of these can do that. A self-fulfilling mental prophecy that ends up coming to fruition. You get yourself so worked up that you start thinking and acting in ways that do end up making people not want to be around you, or not making you work hard to study for that test. And so, you end up failing, so you can reassert the fact that you are right and your mind reading abilities are wonderful. Catastrophizing, exaggerating the impact of events and convincing yourself that if something goes wrong, it will be intolerable and you will just relapse. If I get a craving, you might say, I won't be able to resist and I'll relapse. Or without alcohol, I won't be able to handle my nervousness and work stress. These are all things we can get, or our clients rather, can get very worked up about. Um, and it can drive them to a relapse, because they are convincing themselves that they need this, and that they will not be able to resist. It's the worst case scenario. And then there's emotional reasoning, believing something is true just because it feels true. A person might say, I feel so anxious, so something bad is going to happen. Or, I'm feeling guilty, therefore I must have done something bad. Should statements are a huge one. People have an idea, and this is where the unrealistic expectations can come into play for people. I should be perfect. I should never feel sad. They should have helped me when I needed it. Directing these statements towards others causes frustration, anger, and resentment. Yeah, should statements are very problematic. Labeling and mislabeling, instead of describing, you use a label. Like, he is a bad person instead of he lied, which is the fact of the matter. We relate it to the moral standing of a person or ourselves. Instead of saying, I failed this test, we tell ourselves we're stupid. And then personalization, which is taking blame for some negative event, even though you were not primarily responsible. It's my fault my husband hits me, or my son is unhappy because of me. So the Mayo Clinic states that the addictive process reinforces distorted thought patterns. Your thoughts can harm your emotional life and become a reason to use and continue the addiction. Distorted thoughts can also trigger a relapse. Even if you remain abstinent, these thoughts can make sober living so unpleasant that you may return to the addiction. Now moving on to core beliefs. Core beliefs are a person's most central ideas about themselves and others, and the world. These beliefs act like a lens through which every situation of life is seen. Because of this, people with different core beliefs might be in the same situation but feel, think, and behave very differently. Harmful core beliefs lead to negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, as we just said, whereas rational core beliefs lead to balanced reactions. See here. Sorry, 1-2 forward there. People are not generally born with core beliefs. They're something that are learned. Core beliefs usually develop in childhood or during stressful, traumatic periods of childhood. Many people's beliefs reflect messages from their parents, siblings, peers, teachers, and other important people in their life. Negative core beliefs are not necessarily true, even if they feel true. And core beliefs tend to be rigid and long-standing, but this does not mean that they can't be changed. One example of a situation that might instill a core belief, let's say a child's parent abandons the family. The child might internalize that event and believe that they're not worthy of love, or that they might feel rejected. This event has led to the core belief that they're unlovable, or that they will always be rejected. Anytime this person feels rejected, the core belief becomes stronger. But when they are not even being rejected, they will not even notice the positive, that someone actually accepted them, and they will only focus on those situations where they felt rejected, so that they can reaffirm their belief. So for a person to begin to change these unhelpful beliefs and thoughts, we must first educate them that they exist. You don't know what you've never been taught. And if you never came to the conclusion that your thoughts are sort of irrational on your own, then how are you supposed to know? So for us, we need to help our clients be aware that these thoughts exist, that they are not always true. Um, Many clients are aware that they're having thoughts and feelings that aren't helpful, and emotionally, they just feel horrible about themselves. But they believe that it's true, and they don't think that it can be changed. Um, so with CBT, we put a spotlight on these situations by educating. Uh, Education is a big part of substance use disorder treatment plans. In residential treatment, we have daily educations on top of group processing. These educations include the process of relapse, identifying triggers, and the skills to cope with them. So let's examine exactly what that looks like. This is a very basic example of some CBT worksheets here. Oh, no, well, next. We'll get to the worksheets next. But what they do is identify troubling conditions or situations, and then realizing the thoughts, emotions, and beliefs that those conditions about those conditions or situations, and then we recognize and challenge the distorted thoughts and beliefs, and then we move on to discovering rational ways to think about how they can think about themselves and their lives. Okay, so like I said, this is a very basic example of a worksheet that might be done for CBT. There are lots of different ones from very basic to very detailed. There are thought logs that include even a rating of the emotion that is felt on a scale of 1 to 10, how sad or how angry did that make you feel in that moment? So here we're looking at again a very simple one where we're just going to focus on the event, the very basic of the feeling, of the behavior that we encountered through that that was not helpful or against our core values. And then we try to come up with the automatic thoughts that we had and change that thought to a more realistic or healthier belief. And then the acceptance of the feelings and new behaviors and support that support the goal and values. So here we have, I got into an argument with my family. That was the event or situation. The feelings that came from that were frustrated, angry, sad, hopeless. Behaviors that did not support the goals or values of that person was I contacted my dealer and I got high. So what were the automatic thoughts that came from that situation, those feelings, and that behavior? So when we looked at it with the client said his automatic thoughts were, I am worthless. I will never beat this addiction. Life isn't fair. My family makes it worse. Things were better when I was using. And what's the point in trying? So here we see a lot of distorted thinking, a lot of high expectations, discomfort with life not being fair. My family always makes it worse, sort of all or nothing thinking, right? Things were better when I was using. This is filtering the positive from the negative. And what's the point in trying? So then we move on to more realistic and healthier beliefs. And the client came up with, thinking this way doesn't help. There have been many times my family was helpful. I have been able to have some clean time in the past. If I work at it, I can improve my relationships. My family may be mad, but they'll get over it. And there are people that love me, and I would tell someone else not to give up. And then the completion of the sheet, we go down to uh, acceptance of feelings. How do we feel after we reframe these thoughts in a more healthier, realistic way instead of the automatic negative way? And the client asserts that he feels less frustrated, less angry, more hopeful, and more at peace. And the new behavior that comes from those new thoughts is that he'll contact his sponsor, he'll look for jobs, and he'll do some volunteer work. So we can see how just bringing awareness and helping our clients just be aware of what they're thinking in those automatic reactive moments, and helping them come up with their own better ways of thinking that'll work for them can lead them to a better overall emotional well-being and hopefully physical well-being with preventing relapse. So, Marianne Williams, who is an author and self-help person, quote here, "You must learn a new way to think before you can master a new way to be." And this is very true, as we've seen, exploring our cognitive behavioral therapy. So, if left unexamined, our thoughts can potentially lead down a rabbit hole of negative thoughts and behaviors. If we don't catch our thoughts in the early stage of relapse, we would move to the more difficult stages of relapse to overcome and eventually return to substance use, most likely. CBT is one of the most widely used tools for substance use disorder work, and it has, shown to have great success. And why wouldn't it? Our thoughts are going all the time. In every situation, our thoughts are there to guide our reality, and they are something our clients need to know can be taken for granted. Continual practice of CBT exercise are needed to change long-held automatic thought patterns. This isn't something that can change in a day. CBT does, however, work relatively fast, usually within 6 months of a person actively working to change their thinking patterns. Does a new, healthier way of thinking emerge? It's really a great tool. I know I showed worksheets of how to work like one-on-one with a client, but this is very useful in group work as well. It just takes more sort of illustrating by the group leader, the counselor. When you're in a processing group, and someone is talking about a certain difficult situation that they had, we can stop and examine that situation with them. And not only does that one person get the benefit of the CBT, but the whole group, even though it's not their situation that they found themselves in, even just listening to how you restructure or help the client restructure that one situation can extend to the rest of the group. And as the group processing goes on, anytime one of those situations arises where you can use the method of reframing and examining the thought process that's happening there, we should take advantage of that. So going forward, working with our clients, let's start questioning what were you thinking in that moment rather than how did that make you feel? They can likely tell you exactly how they felt about just about any situation. It seems that how we feel is the overwhelming thing in our face all the time that we're reacting to. But it's very likely that we need to bring to light what their thoughts were. And many clients, when you ask them, what were you thinking about in that moment? The go to answer is, I have no idea, because I was too busy reacting to the emotion that I was feeling, right? Just this automatic reflex to either get defensive or go use, or however I deal with that particular emotion in that particular situation. So, going forward, like I said, let's focus on people's thought process rather than just the feeling that they were having. And hopefully, this will guide you and your client to a better relapse prevention outcome. Thank you everybody for joining me for this presentation today. I hope you learned something from it that will help you in your future endeavors. Have a good day.